Last winter, I spoke about a mock trial in Paris organized by controversial artists, and now this winter, I'm going to speak about a real trial in London. It has nothing to do with the other one, but the topic is equally divisive, if not more so. On trial in the first months of 1923 are sexual pleasure and eugenics. This is Between Two Wars, Season 2, a chronological summary of the interwar years, where we cover the zeitgeist, the culture, the technology, the art, the sports, and much more in the era when, for better or for worse, humanity ushered in modern times. I'm Indy Neidell. The birth pangs of the post-war order are felt again this season. Germany has fallen so far behind on reparations payments that the governments of Belgium and France have ordered the occupation of the Ruhr. This promotes outrage internationally, and unsurprisingly, in Germany itself, leading to a surge of political extremism. The Nazi Party, still a very small party, incidentally hosts its first party congress this season in Munich. Also this winter, diplomats are battling out in Lausanne to define the status of Turkey in the wake of the Turkish War of Independence. Like the fighting itself, it is complicated, drawn out, and results in tragedy. Already Greece and Turkey have agreed to cleanse their respective countries of the other's dominant religion, right? Regardless of ancestry, language, or citizenship, Turkey will forcibly expel all Orthodox Christians to Greece, and Greece will forcibly expel all Muslims to Turkey, setting a very dangerous precedent for the legal removal of citizens from their own nation. The finer points of a complete treaty will be hammered out in the next few months. And as the great powers argue amongst themselves, in England, a controversial feminist takes a Catholic doctor to court for libel. Maurice Stopes is accusing Halliday Sutherland of defamatory remarks in his 1922 book, Birth Control, a statement of Christian doctrine against the Neo-Malthusians. His audience extends to fewer than 1,000 readers, all of whom probably need no persuading of his argument, but Stopes takes him to court nonetheless. I will explain exactly why a bit later on. First, a brief look at the woman who is the offended party and what is at stake here. Maurice Stopes is one of the most prominent English intellectuals of the era. Formerly an academic botanist, she made mainstream fame in 1918 at the age of 37 with the publication of her shocking Married Love. Apparently inspired by her sexless first marriage, Married Love is a guide for couples on how to truly care for each other's needs. It is a somewhat strange read. Some chapters give incredibly detailed anatomical descriptions, such as how a penis becomes erect, and others offer literary outpourings such as, "From the body of the loved one's simple, sweetly colored flesh, which our immemorial creature instincts urge us to desire, there springs not only the bodily wonder of a new bodily life, but also the enlargement of the horizon of human sympathy and the glow of spiritual understanding which a solitary soul could never have attained alone." And it was a sensation upon release. Published at a time when women's liberation and modernism were just starting to really sweep the Western world, Maurice Stopes provided a language to talk about sexuality completely divorced from reproduction. It sold over 2,000 copies in its first 2 weeks of publication, 17,000 after a year, and by now in 1923, over 200,000. Of course, to divorce sexuality and reproduction, you need birth control. Married Love is one of the first popular books to openly promote this, and it quickly becomes Stopes' life work. She campaigns on it with great passion, publishing frequently and regularly organizing public meetings. In 1920, she even circulated a letter to attendees of the upcoming Lambeth Conference, the decennial assembly of bishops to define Anglican doctrine, where she tells them of the divine message she received. "My lords, I speak to you in the name of God. You are his priests, I am his prophet. I speak to you of the mysteries of man and woman. No act of union fulfills the law of God unless the two not only pulse together to the highest climax, but also remain thereafter in long brooding embrace without severance from each other." Unsurprisingly, the bishops ignored her message. Unperturbed, She set up England's first birth control clinic in a working-class area of London in 1921, which by now is a roaring success. It is run by Stopes, but staffed by trained nurses, and a female doctor is available at all times. Services are provided at cost, or even for free if the poorer women can't afford them. And the emphasis is on sex education and contraception rather than medical procedure. All this, just by itself, is hugely controversial, that a woman is openly advocating not only sexual pleasure for the sake of sexual pleasure, but also a means for women to control their reproduction. Well, this goes against everything Christianity teaches about sexual relations and a woman's place within them. This sin alone forms much of Halliday Sutherland's supposed defamation of her. But there's more to it than that. Stopes doesn't just believe in birth control, but also in controlling who can give birth. In other words, she is a eugenicist. Eugenics, or at least population control, is an inherent part of the early birth control movement. As you'll know from our Season 1 episode, Sex, Drugs, and the Right to Vote, the ideas of English cleric Thomas Robert Malthus are very influential just here. His 1798 publication, An Essay on the Principle of Population, predicted that birth rates would one day overtake food production to such an extent that famine, the breakdown of social order, and war would come with it, limiting unwanted births. And so alleviating the burden it places on individual mothers and society as a whole is a cornerstone of the birth control movement. And the biggest proponents of birth control, people like Stopes, believe not only that population growth should be controlled as a general principle, but that certain groups' contribution towards population should be controlled altogether. Marie justifies why in her 1920 book, Radiant Motherhood. Society allows the diseased, the racially negligent, the thriftless, the careless, the feeble-minded, the very lowest and worst members of the community to produce innumerable tens of thousands of stunted, warped, and inferior infants. If they live, a large proportion of these are doomed from their very physical inheritance to be, at the best, but partly self-supporting, and thus to drain the resources of those classes above them which have a sense of responsibility. If the good in our race is not to be swamped and destroyed by the debased, as the fine tree by the parasite, this prolific depravity must be curbed. Such words aren't as controversial as one might think. Eugenics was once a marginal idea, but it has become a mainstream preoccupation, perhaps even the zeitgeist of intellectual circles of the 1920s. Like so many things, the Great War was the catalyzing moment for this. What shocked so many about it was not just the quantity of lives lost, but also the quality. The finest men, the bravest, the fittest, the most superior racial stock were slaughtered on the battlefields, apparently leaving behind a swarm of paupers, degenerates, and invalids free to carry on their reckless breeding. This pessimism about the biological decline of civilization is prevalent throughout Europe and America, but it's felt particularly strongly in Britain, which is already the birthplace of the modern eugenics movement, and where its reputation as the center of civilization is held dear. Even before the war had ended, then Prime Minister David Lloyd George referred to Army medical categorizations when he closed a September 1918 speech saying, "I solemnly warn my countrymen that you cannot maintain an A1 empire with a C3 population." This outlook is shared by politicians and intellectuals across the ideological spectrum, from utopian socialists like H.G. Wells, to rational economists, John Maynard Keynes, to young politicians like Neville Chamberlain. All have different ideas about what the future should look like, but all believe that biological improvement of the race is the only way to secure it. And Stopes sees birth control as the way to make that happen. As she wrote herself in 1921, the campaign for birth control is not merely of eugenic value, but is practically identical in ideal with the final aims of eugenics. Only by intelligent mastery of the procreative powers can the great mass of humanity be awakened to the great responsibility of parenthood. Now, the proposed solutions for racial decline is an episode for another time. Still, it's worth mentioning here that Stopes would probably consider herself a positive eugenicist rather than a negative one because she's explicitly against direct government action in curbing reproduction. There is also no evidence of her clinics ever encouraging working-class mothers to give up bearing children altogether, and she has never advocated for sterilization. But such caveats mean little to religious groups, particularly the Catholic Church, who are incensed at how she apparently mocks the sanctity of God's creation. One particularly outspoken opponent is Dr. Halliday Sutherland. As a medical doctor, he's actually doubly incensed because Stopes has in the past suggested that physicians keep birth rates high to earn more money. Though by no means as famous as Stopes, Sutherland does have a respectable reputation. He's been at the forefront of the fight against tuberculosis and even produced Britain's first ever public health education film back in 1911, the story of John Neidell on how the infection spread. But in 1922, he trained his sights on a new enemy, birth control, a statement of Christian doctrine against the Neo-Malthusians. Here, he declares birth control to not only be a mockery of God's work, but also potentially destructive to civilization itself. He references Stopes' work directly at multiple points, but the passage she takes most issue with is as follows. In the midst of a London slum, a woman who is a doctor of German philosophy has opened a birth control clinic where working women are instructed in a method of contraception described as the most harmful method of which I have had experience. It is truly amazing that this monstrous campaign of birth control should be tolerated by the Home Secretary. The book has only sold about 800 copies, but Stopes still decides to take him to court for defamation. For one, she is personally offended at his remark about her qualifications, believing it both to be a way to link her to unpopular Germany and unlicensed medical practices. But she also undoubtedly sees this as an opportunity to gain even more press coverage for her work. For the last year, she's been working on her case, and now on February 21st, 1923, the libel trial begins in London. The proceedings themselves, they're a pretty straightforward affair, and the result is also rather vague. The jury somehow manages to decree that Sutherland's statements were both defamatory and true, which ironically both Stopes and Sutherland appeal. Stopes eventually kind of wins, receiving £100 in damages, plus half the cost of the proceedings, which cost her at least £13,000. So she still loses money. Sutherland has his costs covered by Catholic organizations. But that doesn't really matter, because Stopes gets what she likely wanted anyway, publicity. Newspapers have in the past refused to publish her advertisements, but they reported extensively on the proceedings, bringing her name to audiences unlikely to have heard it before. Her sales will now shoot up, with Married Love selling more copies between March 1923 and November 1923 than in its first 5 years of publication. This is a decided win for the birth control movement. But the battle is far from over. Eugenics really is a zeitgeist of the interwar era, and controversies surrounding it will stay at the forefront for quite some time. But for now, here's a decidedly more lighthearted piece of history to round the season off. At 6:57 p.m. on March 30th, Alma Cummings begins dancing at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan. 6 dance partners, several shoes, and 27 hours later, she has set the world record for non-stop dancing, finally sitting down at 9:57 p.m. March 31st. The previous month, 2 dance teachers in England set the record at 7 hours, which was then beaten by new records in Scotland, France, and now the US. A marathon dancing craze is sweeping Europe and America. For now, it is just a fad, but it will soon be a roaring business. Dancers will compete for prize money, and paying spectators will be treated to vaudeville performances and even dance floor drama as couples nudge, tickle, and slap one another to stay awake. And for a few moments, the winners will become minor celebrities. When the record is broken again, a few months from now, the victorious dancer will be whisked away in a limousine to put her feet up at a Turkish bath. But the craze is not as glamorous as you might think. A New York World journalist describes a typical dance marathon scene. A dingy hall is littered with worn slippers, cigarette stubs, newspapers, and soup cans, reeking with the odor of stale coffee, tobacco smoke, chewing gum, and smelling salts. Girls in worn bathrobes, dingy white stockings, their arms hanging over their partner's shoulders, dragging aching feet in one short, agonizing step after another. And just like birth control, the craze also leads to moral outrage. Many churches still preach that dancing is a sin anyway, and many authorities see it as dangerous or as an early symptom of insanity. One Washington police chief even tells a newspaper that the epidemic is likely a sign of a coming war or revolution. Later in the decade, there will be government crackdowns on such events, but dance marathons will still continue to be a common feature of American culture well into the 1930s. And with that ends the winter of 1923. Sexual pleasure, eugenics, and dance marathons. All these themes represent different strands of interwar thinking coming together in one place, chiefly in how they are a radical departure from the supposedly suffocating morals of the past. But the developments we've seen in this season are by no means the end of these histories. In fact, they're really only the beginning. As the era goes on, everything from fads to fun to calculated ideologies will be subject to constant criticism and renewal. As ever, you'll have to keep watching this show to find out how the modern world continually defines itself. If you'd like to learn about the geopolitical context of the birth control movement, then you can watch that season 1 episode on it right here. And now we have a whole bunch of TimeGhost collectibles available at the TimeGhost barracks at timeghost.tv. So go check that out. And while you're there, you can join the TimeGhost Army and get some cool perks. Our TimeGhost Army member of the week is Tony Noblak. Thank you, Tony, for your support. We can assure you that none of our funding goes towards eugenics research. And as the Kyhle song goes, one must ask oneself, are we human or are we dancer? A refrain inspired by the words of the father of gonzo journalism, Hunter S. Thompson, actually. America is raising a generation of dancers, afraid to take one step out of line. Here's mud in your eye.